you are Robert Fantina,
Yes.
associated with Beyond War movement,
World Beyond War.
the World Beyond War, and I I hear this song that says, "Last night I dreamed. Last night I had a dream. The world had all the world had agreed to end war from the 50s. I don't remember the wording,
Hmm.
but apparently your colleague, what's his name, Swanson,
David
um,
Swanson. Mhm.
David Swanson, uh, uh, said in a book that he wrote, when the world outlawed war. He wrote, it wasn't a dream. It actually happened some time ago in France.
It
So
did.
maybe you can explain a little bit more about uh,
Sure.
this
That was.
event.
Mhm. It was a bill that was, or an international agreement that was introduced in 1928, signed in 1929, called the Kellogg-Briand Act. It was named after the U.S. Secretary of State, Frank B. Kellogg, and the French Foreign Minister, Aristide Briand, who put together this agreement to end war as the means of settling any international disputes for whatsoever reason that they arose. So
And who
in
agreed? Who agreed to it?
over 62 countries signed onto it, including the United States, which of course was one of the original sponsors of the bill
Mhm.
and an early signatory of it. And most other nations at the time did sign it.
And
Now,
Canada was one of them
Canada
too.
signed Canada
Okay,
signed it. Canada
all
was
right.
one of the early signers also. And of course, the part of the problem was that there were no penalties put in place for violating it. It was sort of the honor system was to be used, and apparently the nations weren't very honorable, because within a matter just a little over a decade, most of the nations that signed it were involved in the
Wars.
most serious war of up to that time, and
The,
that the world had ever seen.
the Second World War.
Yes.
Mhm.
So the war is illegal according to declarations signed by, as I said, over 62 nations, and most, but not all, of those nations have been involved in war since that time.
Hmm.
Multiple wars, some of them.
Yeah, there was an argument during those discussions I read in the book that the League of Nations and later the United Nations, uh, as you said, they didn't want to enforce it. It became a law with no teeth, so
Mhm.
it wasn't enforceable, and that makes the difference between the peace activists that wanted something to be enforced, perhaps, and those peace activists that thought, well, you cannot enforce because by enforcing you include violence again. Can you explain the difference between those two groups that were struggling there to define how do you regulate wars?
Well, there's consequences for violating don't need to be violent. There could be sanctions, there could be international ostracism, uh, end of trade, a curtailment of trade with countries that are offending. We need to think about, and David mentions this in his book, there was a time when if someone had suggested that we end the world end slavery, that would have been unheard of because, well, who's going to, in the United States, who's going to pick our cotton? Who is going
Mm-hmm.
to work in our fields and work in our homes and our plantations? We have to have slavery. Yet we reached a point where, although slavery does exist in some parts of the world, those countries that have slavery, any form of slavery, are really not considered part of the mainstream international community. They are ostracized. Sanctions are placed against them. The same could be said with war. Countries that go to war, such as the United States, which is frequently a war, other countries could cease doing trade with them, could make when issues come up in the UN Security Council criticizing a country that's at war, that could be voted for and supported, and all these things make that nation it kind of shames the nation in the eyes of the world community.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, because few countries are willing to forego war, few countries are willing to say, no, we will solve our problems, international problems through diplomacy. There can't be this these consequences that we would like to see
Mhm.
as a result of violating the Kellogg-Briand Act.
So you cannot really enforce it. You cannot enforce with violence. You can enforce with other means other than violence.
Yes,
I
absolutely.
see. Because uh, that is perhaps the main difference between uh, uh, people that want to go to war to stop war, which
Right,
is
right.
commit a crime to stop a criminal, which is a contradiction in itself.
I think so. We
Mm-hmm.
have so much, as you mentioned very rightly, that we're going to bomb people to tell them that it's not good to bomb people.
Mm.
You know,
Yeah,
we're going to kill people, so you'll stop killing people.
yeah,
It's illogical,
yeah.
yet many of the countries of the world seem to see, or at least the governments see it as very logical and reasonable.
Mm-hmm. Now, what is this culture of war that keeps perpetuating itself? I hear the different traditions that we have in our culture, like uh, monuments and museums and remembrance days, and most detrimental, the manufacturing of weapons, manufacturing
Mhm.
and trade of weapons. Uh, do you think that that has to change?
It certainly has to change. And you've brought up a very interesting and very important point in the manufacture of weapons. War is a very lucrative business
Mm-hmm.
for people in power. And as long as that continues, then as long as some people are making a lot of money from war, we will continue to see the parades, the monuments, the all of the pomp and ceremony that goes with war. And uh, it's interesting that people in the military are considered to be in the service. They're serving. Killing people is not service, and the governments will say, "Well, they're serving our country by keeping us free." They're
Mm-hmm.
not keeping us free. Uh, many countries in the world are free today, and have a certain amount of freedoms, but what the countries aren't free to do sometimes is to have lucrative trade, to have access to the natural resources of another country. So by going to that country, Iraq, you mentioned earlier, is a perfect example. Iraq is an oil-rich country. Dick Cheney was a past oil company executive. Condoleezza Rice, who was Secretary of State at the time, another uh, oil company executive. And because Iraq had a regime that might have been repressive, and I'm sure it was in some regards, the United States created a reason to invade.
Mm-hmm.
How much that had to do with the weapons of mass destruction, which Iraq didn't have, is questionable. You'll recall that Hans Blix and the UN, United Nations inspectors, were gaining unprecedented access to areas of Iraq that they hadn't been able to visit before, looking for these weapons of mass destruction. Yet George Bush told them that they had to leave or they would be killed because he was going to invade. So that's a very perfect, I think, and clear example of when a war could have been avoided. If the
Mm-hmm.
purpose of the war was to prevent Iraq from using weapons of mass destruction,
Mm-hmm.
well, let's find them, which the United Nations was looking for and not finding. And of course, they haven't been found to this day. But there was obviously another reason, another motivation for the United States to go to war against Iraq.
A lot of people understand what the problem is. A lot of people realize about this fights for oil, for resources, diamonds, minerals, um, commerce. But the problem is how to shift away from this culture of, first of all, honoring people from participating in war, like you were saying, without recognizing the regrettable, fatal absence of peaceful uh, dialogue. How can we shift away from that culture?
Part of it, I think, is education. We don't see the suffering that people who are victims of U.S. bombs and other nations' bombs are experiencing. What we're told in the U.S. press, especially, is that these people are our enemies. They want to kill us. You remember Rudy Giuliani in, I think it was 2004, saying that they hate us for our freedoms. They don't
Mhm,
hate us for our
mhm,
freedoms. They hate us because we bomb them all the time.
mhm,
We kill their loved ones.
mhm,
So I think if the American public and people in Canada and throughout the rest of the world could see the abject suffering that these bombs are inflicting on people, then they would begin to not see the glory of war, but to see the horror of war.
mhm. So you're saying education is one of the main things that we can do, educate perhaps the young people, put subject perhaps in high schools and elementary schools and universities where people understand the issues better because the media is not really doing the best job that they could. They're defending more the financial institutions than our social services. Uh, Most of the main media, anyway.
Hmm.
Now, have you heard of the Department of Peace initiative? Uh,
Yes.
yeah, do you think that is another way of perhaps uh, shifting away from our culture of war?
If that could ever be established as a government agency, it
Mm-hmm.
certainly would. The Department of Defense used to be called the Department of War,
Mm-hmm.
and it was changed to make it sound better, mainly because we don't want to foster war, but we need to defend our shores.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. again, that rhetorical we. Uh, and I think a Department of Peace changes the entire thought process
Mm-hmm.
because we're not looking at defense anymore. We're not looking at war. We're looking at peaceful solutions to the world's problems as they relate to any individual country. So in the US, the Department of Peace would look at uh, any alleged threats to the United States and look at peaceful ways of resolving those.
Mm-hmm. So you would support the Department of Peace initiative here in Canada, which was in the past, Parliament was Bill 373, but I guess they'll have to start again because every time there's a new Parliament, they have to start the new bills. You think that is one of the ways to shift our culture to have a Department of Peace?
I
It,
just think that the idea of a Department of Peace should be something everyone can support. Why
mhm.
would someone not support a Department of Peace?
Mhm. Well, a few MPs supported it, and actually it was brought up to the floor and read
Hmm.
one time, but it needs to be read three times. So I think
Hmm.
when the second time came, everybody's busy with other issues, and then they put in the shelf the Department of Peace. So hopefully this time, um, when it comes back for the first reading, it'll be supported by more MPs. We still have to see because our new government is still dropping bombs in Syria. So they Justin Trudeau offered to pull the planes out, but he hasn't done it yet as
Hmm.
of today, which is the 5th of December. So hopefully he will come around and bring them back. But even if they brought them back, sometimes it's just shifting from one country to another, like
Hmm.
uh, Mr. Obama did. He pulled out the troops from Iraq and sent them to Afghanistan.
Hmm.
So it's
Hmm.
not really ending war; it's just shifting the furniture. So it is a problem, but it's something that we have to hope that something will change.
And Mr. Trudeau also said he said that he would stop the bombing, but he would train soldiers. So again, as you said, sort of shifting the furniture, because if he does stop sending the planes over, then that's a good thing. But if he's training people from other countries to do it,
Yeah, you're
where
in
is
this.
the gain?
We're in the same game. Yeah. Now, how can we shift also the this military training? Because we train people, young people, to kill, and then when they get killed, we get surprised. How
Hmm.
can we change this? military training which uses violence to bring order, and yeah, they achieve a temporal order. But do you think that we should have some youth brigades, maybe a new time of recruitment of youth to train to manage conflict?
I think that would be an excellent idea. I think part of the thing is that that has to be seen as a very desirable and prestigious activity.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, when people enlist in the military, people say, "Oh, how wonderful they're serving their country," and this sort of thing. Uh, high recruiters, at least in the United States, are able to go into local high schools,
Mm-hmm.
and they're these uh, handsome soldiers with their medals and their uniforms, and people are impressed by that. There has to be uh, a similar or parallel feeling about a youth brigade that's trained in conflict resolution, international conflict resolution, that is seen as prestigious and that these people are
Mm-hmm.
looked up to
Mm-hmm.
and are seen in a very positive light.
And how do we change it?
Well, partly is the youth brigade that you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
some kind of training for young people that if they're concerned about the world situation, there is something positive they can do without either jeopardizing their lives or jeopardizing the lives of other innocent people.
Mm-hmm.
That diplomacy is not an outdated or outmoded concept. It's one, in fact, that has been tried too seldom
Mm-hmm.
to really say it's outmoded.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to see war as a violent, deadly, uh, destructive event that kills more innocent people, men, women, and children, than any alleged enemies it is intended to kill. Once people can see that, my a baby in Canada is no different than a baby in Syria. And when a bomb is dropped on a home and that baby is blown to bits, that's a tragic, violent, and shocking event. But in North America, we don't see much of that. We
Mm-hmm.
hear about uh, this many terrorists were killed. Well, this many terrorists, who generally the United States has defined as terrorists, and we don't talk about their families that have died with them.
Mm-hmm.
People need to know that. And when we can get that information out in the
Mm-hmm.
public, and it's coming out more and more, not on the media,
Mm-hmm.
corporate owned media, but through social media,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which is doing a lot, I think, to
Bring
alter the
the
conversations a
yeah,
little bit.
bring the alternative view. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So education and media and training, and how about the manufacturing of weapons and trade of weapons? Because here in British Columbia, we have places where they're building frigates for war, warships.
Hmm.
I don't know, 10, 12, something like that for billions of dollars. And at the same time, when we need ferries, we send them to be built in Germany or Poland, somewhere else.
Hmm.
And I figure there's something wrong here in this picture because we're building all this weapons of mass destruction, and what do we expect to do with them? So that kind of
Hmm.
brings war again.
By building warships and then giving them an opportunity to be in war, then it perpetuates the cycle. And
Mm-hmm.
again, people are making lots of money. If you build a warship and it gets damaged or destroyed, you have to build another one. Well, someone's making a lot of money from that. It's not the same with ferries. The profit margin isn't as great. However, there are alternatives that can be done. We don't need to create to be building those warships in the United States. We don't need to be uh, building the amount of weaponry that's being built. Those industries can be used for uh, for transportation,
Mm-hmm.
for
Mm-hmm.
any number of different
Mm-hmm.
products and services, and that also needs to change. And
I think they could still make profits by building ferries instead of warships because they have a price and they have investment and the government would pay for it. But it's just why do we have to build something that put us in the way to war?
and switching over to a different industry, would there would be some adjustment, but it's certainly doable.
Mm, it's doable, but do we have the culture? Are people ready to do that shift? Because if say a factory that is gonna produce ambulances instead of machine guns, and that factory is gonna list a little bit less money, is gonna make less money than making machine guns. The people that work there have to consider: are we going to take a cut on our wages? And if we're going to lose a little bit of money, maybe it's not convenient for us. Therefore, let's keep on making weapons because that give us more money. So I think it's not just the government sometimes or the owners of the plants, but people themselves. If they're willing to work, like see Tarzans, a lot of people went to work in the Tarzans because it made a lot of money
Hmm.
with disregarding the environmental impact,
Hmm.
right? And I see the same thing in the manufacturing weapons. If you make more money, even as an employee, so it's something in the culture of our society that
Hmm.
has to be changed.
And that's we talked about the education. If people knew what those machine guns were doing, if and they know they kill people, but if they could see the result of what they're building in the devastation that they are wreaking on innocent people, then they might begin to think, well, yeah, I'd rather make a train.
Yeah,
And if if I make a little less money, it's okay. But they have to be able to see that, and right now they're not seeing it.
yeah. I have one more question here, and that's how to have foreign policy that government makes. Like government decides, oh, we're gonna go send 6 planes over to the Middle East and all that. That foreign policy, defense policy. I don't know if it's foreign or defense, but or both. But it's usually not in harmony with what the majority of citizens feel. If there is this disconnection between what people want and what the government's their agenda is, whoever is
Mm-hmm.
manipulating them, lobbying them, uh, how can we come out of um, this impasse between the government and the majority of people?
I think part of it, and I mentioned education before,
Mm-hmm.
people need to look beyond what the government tells them,
Mm-hmm.
beyond what their leaders are trying to scare them with,
Mm-hmm.
and look at the past. Look at the record that the U.S. has invented enemies for generations that were non-existent and has brought the U.S. into war. And by bringing that, then coalitions, Canada has joined in with U.S. wars as currently in Syria, as you mentioned, and other countries around the world that the U.S. brings into wars against the wishes of the people. Now, it's easy to say that the people can control it with a ballot box by their vote, but that isn't true when you have uh, candidates that are very similar to each other from different parties
Mm-hmm.
and are saying basically the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that brings up an entirely different discussion about the need for
Mm-hmm.
a viable third party in
Mm-hmm.
both of our countries.
Yeah, yeah, a party or even independents that have a
Hmm.
different agenda, because
Yes.
sometimes it's perhaps it's more difficult to change the platform of a party than it would be for an individual to say, "I'm going to run for peace. I'm going to run, even if you don't win. At least the platform that your ideas get put
Hmm.
out there." And
Hmm.
I think that the idea of referendum is something that hasn't caught on yet, but we have now and then referendums here, and politicians don't like it too much because it takes their power away. But
Hmm.
if we push for, if not referendums which are binding an obligation to the government, at least a plebiscite, which is like a poll, to see
Hmm.
how many people support our planes in Syria and Iraq, how many people don't. What is an alternative? If we had this kind of plebiscites, do you think that would be an alternative besides education and alternative media, as you
Hmm.
mentioned, but also pushing for plebiscites?
Right. And I think even a non-binding referendum would at least start the discussion.
That's
Uh,
right.
we could go to our MP and say, in the last election,
Yeah.
the people said they wanted, you know,
Yeah.
and to bombing of Syria. Why are we still bombing Syria
Yeah.
if this is what the people want?
Yeah, that's true. But unfortunately, that's precisely what we do every elections day. On elections day, we put our ballot in, and what we're doing is actually giving them power of attorney and saying, now you make all the decisions for me,
Hmm.
right? And
Right.
obviously, they cannot make all the decisions that you like because you might agree
Hmm.
with 3 or 4, but you might disagree with another 10. And
Hmm.
then obviously you run to this conflict for the next 4 years until the next election. The next election, they promise, but then we go and give them power again. So I think
Hmm.
there has to be a new kind of uh, candidates that say, I will legislate only by plebiscite. You will tell me, if I vote for something in Parliament or in the Legislative Assembly, you have to tell me which way to go. So you run a referendum, and the government electoral offices have the budgets, the knowledge, the technology
Hmm.
to run those referendums. They can do
Hmm.
very easily, and they can be as secure as your credit card is, right? And your vote.
Hmm.
So if they could do that, and if we demand that from the politicians when we vote, then we might start seeing some difference because politicians will have to ask for the opinion of the people. They won't be free to do whatever they want.
And I don't think a referendum would be needed on every single bill that comes up, every single issue.
Mm-hmm.
But on the major issues that are impacting life and death,
Mm-hmm.
then yes,
Mm-hmm.
they need to know what the people want them to do.
That's right.
So in situation of war,
Yeah.
uh, and this is
Yeah.
too serious for them to ignore the will of the people.
That's right. Well, we have very serious issues like free trade agreements that
Hmm.
are very serious, affect our economy and all that, and
Hmm.
our standard of living. We have Bill C-51 that, to me, should
Yes.
be put to a referendum.
Hmm.
If not the referendum, at least the plebiscite.
Yes. Open the discussion rather than this paternalistic, I know what's best for you,
That's
so
what
I'm
they
going to
say.
listen into your telephone calls or whatever. Yeah.
That's right.
Uh,
Yeah.
People should be able to make decisions for themselves about how their lives will be regulated,
Mm-hmm.
how their tax dollars will be spent.
That's right.
Certainly, every dime of my tax dollars isn't going to go to something that benefits me directly,
Mm-hmm.
but I do want to assure when I can that my tax dollars aren't going to killing people.
Develop the system within the government so we can participate in it. Yeah.
It isn't participatory government what a democracy is all about. So
Well, we get confused between representative democracy and
mhm,
participatory democracy.
mhm,
Because in representative democracy, we just give our power away on elections
mhm,
day. In direct democracy, we're saying, no, I don't want to give you the power to legislate. I give you the power to be basically a bureaucrat, a representative of our will. We, the
mhm,
people, will legislate.
mhm.
So,
You sign the paperwork. Yeah.
That's right. You have administrators like a manager,
Mhm,
but not a
mhm,
legislator. So
mhm,
we need to change that.
mhm.
Robert
That's
Fantina, thank you very much for giving me such a wonderful time. I think
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
we agree in most of the cases, so we can discuss. We can fight.
No, we can't, unfortunately.
Yeah, right.